A poor little boy sets up a lemonade stand in an attempt to fund his chemo, only for a billionaire to notice him and pull out his checkbook, ready to change the boy's life forever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays over the small park where Tommy had set up his lemonade stand. A rickety folding table wobbled under the weight of a plastic pitcher filled with slightly too watery lemonade, a few mismatched cups, and a hand-drawn sign that read in large, uneven letters, "Lemonade for my chemo, help me fight." The words were bold, outlined in crayon, with a little smiley face drawn in the corner. Despite his frail frame and the weariness in his pale blue eyes, Tommy wore a grin as wide as ever, greeting each passerby with an enthusiastic wave. Most people glanced at the sign and offered a sympathetic smile but kept walking. A few fumbled for change and dropped a couple of coins into the makeshift donation jar, offering quiet words of encouragement. Tommy didn't mind the ones who ignored him, he was used to it. The important thing was that he was out here, trying. Grandma Evelyn had told him they would manage somehow, but Tommy knew better. He had overheard her late at night, whispering on the phone, her voice tight with worry as she spoke about the rising hospital bills. He had seen her sit at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples, staring at numbers on a page that didn't seem to add up. He wanted to help. He had to help. He straightened his back as another figure approached. An older man in an expensive charcoal suit, silver hair neatly combed back, stopped just a few feet away, adjusting the cuff of his crisp white shirt. He looked out of place here, too polished, too put together for a stroll through this part of town. Tommy could tell from the way the man's shoes shined that he wasn't someone who usually stopped for roadside lemonade. But there was something in his face, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even something deeper, that made him linger. 50 cents a cup, Tommy piped up, standing a little taller. Or $1 if you want the VIP treatment, which means I won't judge you if you don't finish it. The man chuckled softly. His name was Richard Harrington, though Tommy had no way of knowing that yet. Richard had made a fortune in industries Tommy wouldn't care about: real estate, tech investments, big companies with big names. He had more money than he could ever spend, more properties than he could ever live in, and yet, standing there, looking at this little boy with his too thin arms and too bright smile, he felt something stir in him that had nothing to do with business. VIP treatment, huh? Richard murmured. Sounds tempting. Tommy grinned. I'd recommend it. This stuff might be more sugar water than lemonade, so the VIP package gets you a polite thank you and no gagging faces. Richard let out another soft laugh, then bent slightly to examine the sign. His smile faded as he took in the words. Lemonade for your chemo? His voice lost its humor, turning more serious. Tommy nodded, as casual as if he were discussing the weather. Yup. The doctors say I gotta do a bunch of treatments, and those aren't cheap. So I figured, why not start a business? I mean, it's either this or becoming a famous YouTuber, and I don't have a good camera. Richard's fingers twitched at his side, an old habit from when he was making big decisions. He studied the boy more closely. The hollowed-out cheeks, the way his t-shirt hung a little too loose on his small frame. His body language, energetic, sure, but there was something fragile about him, something that made Richard's chest tighten. How much do you need? Richard asked, his voice quieter. Tommy tilted his head. For the lemonade? It's still 50 cents. Richard exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. No. For the treatments. Tommy blinked. No one had ever asked him that. Most people just patted his head, gave him a few bucks, and walked away. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sign, and for the first time in a long while, he hesitated. A lot, he finally said. More than I can make with lemonade. But Grandma says we'll figure it out. Richard nodded slowly, processing the situation. He had made snap decisions worth millions before. He had closed deals that had taken months to negotiate in a matter of minutes. But nothing in his decades of business experience had prepared him for this moment. A child, an orphan, standing on a sidewalk, trying to sell lemonade to save his own life. Something inside him settled. All right, Richard said, pulling out a sleek leather checkbook from inside his jacket. Let's make sure you don't have to worry about this anymore. Tommy's jaw nearly dropped as he watched Richard scribble something down. His eyes widened when he caught a glimpse of the number. Wait. He threw up his hands. Are you serious? Like really serious? This isn't one of those prank videos, is it? Richard tore the check from the book and held it out. I don't joke about things like this, kid. Tommy stared at it. That's a lot of zeros. Richard smiled faintly. That's the idea. For the first time since this conversation had started, Tommy didn't have a joke ready. He reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of the paper, as if afraid it might disappear. Then, in a flash, his energy returned. He snatched the check and let out a whoop loud enough to startle a couple walking by. Grandma is never gonna believe this. Tommy practically vibrated with excitement. You have to come with me. You have to tell her yourself, or she's gonna think I stole it. Richard hesitated. He hadn't planned on getting that involved. But looking at Tommy's sheer joy, the way his exhaustion seemed to disappear for a moment, he knew there was no way he could say no. All right, Richard sighed, shaking his head with a smirk. Lead the way. Tommy grabbed his wrist, his tiny hand barely wrapping around Richard's fingers, and dragged him forward. Richard, a man used to commanding boardrooms and navigating high-stakes business deals, found himself half-jogging to keep up with a boy who had just sold him on the most important investment of his life. As they disappeared down the street, the lemonade stand sat abandoned, the sign flapping slightly in the breeze. The makeshift donation jar, half full of coins and crumpled bills, remained behind, forgotten. Tommy wouldn't need it anymore. Tommy practically dragged Richard down the cracked sidewalk, his tiny fingers wrapped around the billionaire's wrist with surprising strength. His sneakers slapped against the pavement, and every few steps, he glanced up at Richard with barely contained excitement. You have no idea how awesome this is. Grandma's gonna flip. Like flip. He swung their hands dramatically to emphasize his point, as if Evelyn might actually go airborne from the shock. Richard smirked, adjusting his pace to keep up with the boy's enthusiasm. I take it she doesn't usually get this kind of news? Tommy snorted. She gets news, all right. Just not the fun kind. Mostly it's, here's another bill, or oh look, the fridge is empty again. You're about to become her least favorite person and her favorite person at the same time. He grinned, then paused, suddenly thoughtful. Actually, mostly least favorite. She doesn't trust rich people. Richard raised a brow. That's so? Oh yeah? She says they didn't get rich by handing out charity. Richard hummed at that, making a mental note. He wasn't unfamiliar with skepticism. He had spent decades in a world where trust was a currency often harder to earn than money itself. Still, he wasn't here to win anyone over. He was here because a boy had needed help, and he could give it. That was all. Tommy finally skidded to a stop in front of a small, weathered house with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. The yard was mostly dirt with patches of stubborn grass, and a worn-out lawn chair sat beside the door. Okay, Tommy whispered, suddenly serious. Just let me do the talking. Before Richard could respond, the boy shoved open the front door and burst inside. Grandma! He hollered at full volume. Richard followed at a more measured pace, stepping cautiously over the threshold. The inside of the house was small but tidy, the furniture mismatched but well-loved. Faint sense of something herbal, probably tea, lingered in the air. He barely had time to take in his surroundings before a woman appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Evelyn Whitaker was not what Richard had expected. She wasn't frail or hunched with age. She stood tall and sharp-eyed, her graying hair tied back in a simple bun. Her gaze was piercing, filled with both exhaustion and quiet strength. She didn't look at Richard at first. Her focus zeroed in on Tommy. "Why are you yelling?" she scolded, her voice lined with exasperation but also something softer, something tired. Then her sharp eyes flicked up and landed on Richard. There was no flicker of surprise, no gasp of recognition at the sight of a well-dressed man standing in her living room. Instead, her expression immediately hardened, as if she had been expecting the worst before he even opened his mouth. "Who's this?" she asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Tommy beamed and pointed a triumphant finger at Richard. "A rich guy who's paying for my chemo." Silence. A long, charged silence. Evelyn's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted, her fingers tightening slightly around the dish towel. She took a slow breath, then looked Richard up and down. "Did he now?" she said, her tone carefully neutral. Richard had seen a lot in his life, boardrooms filled with billionaires, cutthroat negotiations, ruthless tycoons, but he suddenly had the distinct feeling he was severely outmatched by this woman. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She set the dish towel aside and crossed her arms. "And why would you do that?" Richard expected this. He had been in this world long enough to know that no one trusts free money, especially not the people who need it most. He kept his voice level, calm, with no trace of defensiveness. "Because I could." "That's not an answer," Evelyn shot back, not missing a beat. Tommy groaned. "Grandma, come on. He's not a kidnapper." "I checked. No creepy van." Richard let out a short chuckle at that, but Evelyn's expression remained stony. She didn't look impressed. She didn't look grateful. She just looked tired. And Richard understood why. When life had repeatedly dealt you loss, when you had scraped by with nothing but grit and sheer willpower, a man showing up in a suit with a checkbook didn't look like a miracle, he looked like a trap. Evelyn finally exhaled, the tension in her shoulders softening just slightly. "I don't take charity," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's not charity," Richard replied. "It's a choice. Mine. I saw a boy selling lemonade to save his own life. That's not something I could walk away from." Evelyn held his gaze, measuring, calculating. Then, without breaking eye contact, she turned to Tommy. "And what do you think, kiddo?" Tommy didn't hesitate. "I think if a rich guy is dumb enough to give us money, we should take it." Richard coughed, half laughing, half surprised. Evelyn blinked, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "Lord help me," she muttered. Finally, she turned back to Richard and gave him the slightest nod, a reluctant acceptance. "All right. You want to throw money at a lost cause, be my guest." Tommy whooped, throwing his hands in the air. "Ha! Knew you'd cave." Richard, despite himself, felt a small smirk tug at the corner of his lips. "I don't think your grandson is as innocent as he pretends to be." "Oh, I know he's not," Evelyn muttered, side-eyeing Tommy. Then she sighed again, rubbing her forehead. "But fine. We'll take the help. For him." Richard nodded. He wasn't expecting gratitude, and honestly he respected her for it. "But I'm telling you right now," Evelyn added, fixing him with a stern glare. "You will not waltz in here thinking you can fix our lives with money. It doesn't work like that." Richard held up a hand in surrender. "I wouldn't dream of it." "Good." She turned to Tommy. "Now I know you didn't pack up that lemonade stand properly before running in here." Tommy groaned, slumping. "Grandma, nope. Go. Before I make you write me an essay about responsibility." Tommy huffed, casting a betrayed look at Richard. "I thought rich people were supposed to make life easier." Richard chuckled as Tommy trudged back toward the door. "I don't think I can help you there, kid." When the boy was gone, Evelyn turned back to Richard. "If you're serious about helping him, then fine. But I'll be watching you, Mr. Harrington." Richard nodded, hands in his pockets, the ghost of a smile on his face. "Wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Whitaker." She narrowed her eyes. "Ms. Whitaker." Richard's smile grew just slightly. "Noted." And for the first time, something in Evelyn's gaze shifted. Not warmth, not yet. But maybe. Just maybe. Something close to curiosity. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of logistics, appointments, and hushed conversations between doctors and administrators. Richard moved quickly, calling in favors, ensuring that Tommy would get the best possible care. The boy had already been scheduled for treatment at a local, underfunded hospital, but Richard had him transferred to one of the top medical facilities in the state, complete with the best oncologists and cutting-edge treatments. Evelyn didn't argue, not because she trusted him, but because she had no choice. She was too tired, too overwhelmed, too aware that without Richard's help, Tommy's chances were far slimmer. The hospital was immaculate, the kind of place Evelyn had only ever seen on TV, with bright, sunlit halls and nurses who moved with quiet efficiency. Tommy was immediately taken in for tests, prepped for the first round of chemotherapy. He was terrified but grinning anyway, making jokes to keep himself from thinking too hard about the needles, the machines, the looming uncertainty. Richard sat with him before the first session, watching as the boy fiddled with the sleeve of his hospital gown. "Well," Tommy sighed dramatically, "if I make it through this, I'm totally getting ice cream every day for a year. Grandma says that's not how nutrition works, but what does she know? She still eats raisins like they're a treat." Richard smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive shirt. "Ice cream every day? That might be a little ambitious." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Says the guy who dropped a ridiculous amount of money on a kid he just met. If I'm here, I might as well aim high." Richard chuckled but didn't argue. The boy had a point. Instead, he placed a small, wrapped box on Tommy's bedside table. Tommy's eyes widened in curiosity as he ripped the paper away, revealing a sleek, brand-new handheld gaming console. "Whoa," Tommy whispered, holding it like it was made of glass. You got me a Switch? Like an actual, real, non-imaginary Switch? I figured you might need something to pass the time," Richard said casually, though he couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing the boy's genuine excitement. "I had my assistant pick it up this morning." Tommy turned the device over in his hands, staring at it for a moment before glancing up. His voice softened. "Nobody's ever gotten me something this cool before." Richard felt something tighten in his chest, but before he could respond, a new voice cut in. "That's not a toy you'll be playing all day," Evelyn said, stepping into the room with a look that could turn steel into dust. She glanced at the console before narrowing her eyes at Richard. "Really? This is what you think he needs?" Richard, used to being challenged in boardrooms but somehow always thrown off by this woman, met her gaze evenly. "I think he needs distractions. And something that makes him happy." Evelyn exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Happiness doesn't cure cancer." "No," Richard agreed, leaning back in his chair. "But it makes the fight easier." Tommy, sensing the tension, grinned like a little troublemaker and swung his legs over the side of the bed. "You guys argue like an old married couple." Richard nearly choked on air, and Evelyn's glare could have shattered glass. "Excuse me?" she snapped. Tommy, completely unfazed, wiggled his eyebrows. "I mean, come on. You bicker like an old sitcom couple who haven't realized they're in love yet." Richard cleared his throat, schooling his expression back into neutrality. "That's quite the imagination you've got." Evelyn rolled her eyes. "That's quite the nonsense you're encouraging." Tommy shrugged, amused with himself. "I'm just saying, I've seen the way he looks at you, Grandma. All broody billionaire vibes. If this was a movie, you two would have already slow danced in a kitchen by now." Richard pressed a hand over his mouth to hide his laughter, but Evelyn whirled on him immediately. "Don't you dare encourage him." Richard raised both hands in surrender, enjoying this way more than he should. "I wouldn't dream of it." Tommy grinned victoriously before turning back to his game, the first session of chemotherapy about to begin. The moment the nurse walked in, the energy in the room shifted. Despite all the jokes, all the teasing, the reality of what was happening sank in. The floor was prepared, the machine beeped softly, and the treatment began. Tommy took a deep breath, gripping the switch like it was a lifeline. Evelyn sat by his side, her fingers twitching slightly as she resisted the urge to fuss over him. Richard, unexpectedly, stayed too. He had planned to leave after making sure everything was taken care of, but something about watching the boy's face, the way he clenched his jaw but still managed to smirk through the discomfort, kept him rooted in place. As the hours stretched on, Richard continued visiting. It started as a polite obligation, he had promised to help, after all, but before long, it became something else. He found himself invested. He brought books, puzzles, things to keep Tommy occupied between treatments. He sat in that hospital room far more than he should have. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, suspicious but silent. She didn't ask him to leave, but she never went out of her way to welcome him either. Most of the time, she sat by Tommy's side, reading to him or brushing his hair back when he fell asleep. Other times, she simply stared out the window, lost in thought. It was Tommy who noticed first. "You like having him around," he announced one afternoon, as Evelyn tucked a blanket around him. She scoffed. "I tolerate him." No, you like it. You like having another grown-up here. Someone who isn't me." Evelyn's fingers froze mid-motion. Tommy turned his head toward Richard, who had just walked in, carrying yet another book. "Tell her I'm right." Richard smirked. "You're right." Evelyn shot him a glare. "You're both insufferable." Tommy snickered, curling deeper under the blanket. "See? Old sitcom couple energy." Richard chuckled as he pulled up a chair. Maybe the kid wasn't entirely wrong. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Tommy would joke, Evelyn would scoff, Richard would smirk, and somehow, despite all the tension, they started to fall into something resembling a routine. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was something. The days blurred into one another, filled with the quiet hum of machines, the scent of antiseptic, and the steady rhythm of Tommy's treatment. He was weaker now, the effects of chemotherapy taking their toll, but his spirit never wavered. He still cracked jokes, still made sure to give the nurses a hard time in the most charming way possible, still teased Richard and Evelyn every chance he got. But there were moments, fleeting but heavy, when he would stare at his reflection in the small hand mirror Evelyn brought him, touching his thinning hair with a look that was too old for a child his age. Moments when his usual bravado wavered, and the exhaustion became too much to hide. Richard had never spent this much time in a hospital before, at least not in this way. The waiting, the uncertainty, the helplessness, it was a new kind of battlefield, one where money meant little and patience meant everything. He found himself staying longer than necessary, stopping by even when he had nothing to bring, nothing to say. Tommy expected him now, would look up from whatever book or game he was playing and greet him with an exaggerated, "Ah, the billionaire graces us with his presence once again." Richard would shake his head, smirk, and take his usual seat by the bed. Evelyn remained guarded. She accepted his presence because Tommy did, but she never let herself soften around him. If Richard brought food, she'd thank him but make a point of not eating it while he was looking. If he asked how she was holding up, she'd say, "Fine," in a tone that meant, "Don't ask again." But he caught glimpses of something else in the way she lingered outside Tommy's room when she thought no one was watching, the way her fingers would brush over Tommy's wrist after he fell asleep, as if making sure he was still there. Then, one night, everything went wrong. Richard had been heading home, for once, after a particularly long day at the hospital. He had just reached his car when his phone rang. It was Evelyn. She never called him. His stomach dropped before he even answered. "He's burning up," she said, her voice strained, frantic in a way he'd never heard before. "The fever won't go down. They're moving him to ICU." Richard didn't ask questions. He turned around, walked back inside, and didn't stop until he was at Tommy's door. The scene inside was chaos. Nurses moved quickly, adjusting 4 lines, checking monitors, their expressions tense. Evelyn stood to the side, arms wrapped tightly around herself, looking small in a way Richard had never seen. Tommy lay motionless, his usually bright face flushed with fever, his breaths shallow. The sight of him, the kid who had spent weeks making everyone laugh, now too weak to even open his eyes, made something inside Richard clench. Evelyn barely looked at him when he stepped beside her, but he saw the way her fingers twitched, like she wanted to grab onto something but refused to show weakness. He hesitated only for a second before reaching out, letting his hand rest lightly on her forearm. She didn't move away. They said the infection hit fast, she whispered, still staring at the bed. His immune system is too weak. If they don't get it under control soon. She swallowed, shaking her head. I don't think I can survive losing him too. Richard's grip tightened ever so slightly. He wasn't sure why, but he needed her to know she wasn't alone in this. You won't have to, he said, voice steady. He's a fighter. He's got this. Evelyn finally turned to look at him, her sharp blue eyes clouded with exhaustion and fear. For the first time, Richard saw the weight of it all, not just tonight, but the years of struggle, the loss of her daughter, the quiet, unrelenting grief that had shaped her into the woman she was now. The kind of grief that left scars no one could see. And for once, she didn't push him away. They sat together in the small, sterile waiting area outside the ICU, neither saying much. Richard wasn't used to waiting. He was a man of action, of solutions, but this was something he couldn't buy his way out of. All they could do was hope. It was hours later when a nurse approached them. Evelyn tensed, gripping the armrests of her chair like she was bracing for a blow. Richard kept his eyes on the nurse's face, looking for any sign of what was coming. And then, he's stable. Evelyn exhaled so sharply she nearly collapsed in on herself. Richard let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. They weren't out of the woods, but Tommy had made it through the worst of it. For now, that was enough. When they finally stepped into the room, Tommy was still pale, still weak, but awake. His eyes fluttered open just enough to register their presence, and a slow, sleepy smile tugged at his lips. Oh good, he croaked, voice hoarse but still full of mischief. Did I die? 'Cause this looks like a miracle. Evelyn let out a breathy laugh, half relief, half exhaustion. She stepped forward, brushing his damp hair back. Not this time, kid. Tommy's gaze flicked toward Richard, then down to their hands, still resting together on the rail of his bed. His smirk widened. Are you two finally friends? Evelyn snatched her hand back so fast it was almost comical. Richard, despite everything, chuckled. You just survived a near-death experience, and that's the first thing you say? Tommy gave a weak shrug. Gotta keep the people entertained. Evelyn rolled her eyes but didn't look quite as annoyed as usual. She sat on the edge of the bed, reaching for Tommy's hand. You gave us a scare. Yeah, sorry about that. Tommy's eyelids drooped, his energy quickly fading. But, don't get too comfortable. I'm gonna live forever, just despite cancer. Richard watched as Evelyn smiled softly, shaking her head. You really are impossible. Tommy hummed in agreement, already drifting off again. His breathing was still fragile, still too quiet for comfort, but he was here. That was all that mattered. Richard let his gaze drift to Evelyn. She was still tense, still clearly shaken, but the walls around her were cracked, just a little. Something had shifted between them in those long hours of waiting, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge just yet. They sat in silence as Tommy slept, shoulder to shoulder, a quiet understanding settling between them. Neither spoke of what had happened, of the way their hands had fit together so naturally, of the way they had leaned on each other when everything had nearly fallen apart. For now, just being there was enough. Tommy's fever scare had shaken them all, but as the days passed and he grew stronger, the tension in the hospital room slowly began to ease. The boy was still weak, his energy coming and going in waves, but his humor never wavered. If anything, he seemed to be using it as a weapon, wielding it against the heaviness that had hung over them for so long. And his new favorite target? The undeniable, unspoken shift between Evelyn and Richard. It started subtly at first, offhand comments, playful glances. But then Tommy, being Tommy, escalated. You know, Grandma, he said one afternoon, lounging in bed with his switch in hand. Rich people date too. Evelyn, seated in the chair beside him, didn't even look up from her crossword puzzle. Good for them. Richard, who had been reading a newspaper across the room, glanced over. Was that supposed to mean something? Tommy sighed dramatically, clicking a few buttons on his game. I dunno, I'm just saying. You're rich, you're old, you're single. Grandma's old, single, and almost tolerates you. It just makes sense. Evelyn snapped her pencil in half. I have no idea what you're talking about. Richard chuckled, folding his paper neatly. Sounds like the kid's been watching too many rom-coms. Tommy smirked. Or maybe I just have eyes. Evelyn shot him a look. You have a death wish. The back and forth continued, Tommy throwing out hints like candy, but Evelyn always batted them away without hesitation. Richard found it amusing, mostly because Evelyn's reactions were so sharp, so genuinely exasperated, that they bordered on entertaining. But beneath all of it, something in him stirred, because Tommy wasn't wrong. He and Evelyn had found a strange sort of rhythm in the past few weeks, a balance that neither of them had anticipated. It was late one evening when the walls between them cracked just a little more. Tommy had fallen asleep after a long day, his body exhausted from treatment. The quiet hum of the hospital filled the room, and for the first time in hours, there was nothing to distract them from each other. Evelyn sat beside Tommy's bed, absently smoothing out the blanket covering him. Richard sat across from her, hands clasped in his lap. It wasn't awkward, but it was something. A silence that felt heavy, like it was waiting to be filled. She was the first to break it. Why are you still here? Richard raised a brow. You want me to leave? She exhaled, shaking her head. No. I just don't get it. This isn't your life, but you keep showing up like it is. He leaned forward slightly. Maybe because I want to. Evelyn scoffed. And why would you want to? This is messy. It's complicated. You could have walked away after writing that check, but instead, you're sitting in a hospital room at 10 o'clock at night, watching a kid drool in his sleep. Richard glanced at Tommy, who was, in fact, slightly drooling. He smiled faintly before turning back to Evelyn. Because I care. Her jaw tensed, her fingers still against the blanket. Why? Richard hesitated, then exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Because I know what it's like to lose someone. Evelyn stilled. She hadn't expected that answer. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. My wife. She died about 20 years ago. Cancer. It was fast, aggressive. One moment we were making plans for the future, and the next, I was planning a funeral. We didn't have kids, just the two of us. And after she was gone, I buried myself in work. I built my company, made more money than I could ever spend, but I never remarried. Never let myself get close to anyone again. It was easier that way. Evelyn stared at him, her expression unreadable. So why now? Richard let out a dry chuckle. Honestly? I don't know. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, something pulled me out of my routine. Maybe because Tommy reminds me of what it means to fight for something. Or maybe I just... He trailed off, shaking his head. I guess I got tired of being alone. Evelyn sat there for a long moment, letting his words settle. She understood the feeling too well. The grief that never really went away, the loneliness that became a companion over the years. She had lost her daughter, lost the life she thought she would have, and though she never admitted it out loud, the weight of it still crushed her on the hardest days. But that didn't mean she was ready to let someone in. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She finally looked away, shifting in her chair. Loss doesn't mean you have to start collecting strays. Richard chuckled. You saying you're a stray? Evelyn huffed. I'm saying I don't need rescuing. I never said you did. She gave him a sharp look, then exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. You keep saying things like that, and I might start thinking you're not as insufferable as I thought. That's a terrifying thought. Richard mused. Evelyn rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched just slightly. She caught herself before it could become anything real. Don't get ahead of yourself. The moment ended when Tommy stirred, blinking sleepily. His gaze landed on them, sitting across from each other, and his smile was immediate. Well, 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 he mumbled, voice groggy. Look at you two, having a moment. Evelyn groaned. Go back to sleep. Tommy yawned, stretching lazily. Just saying. If I wake up and find out you guys ran off and got married, I better get cake. Richard smirked. Chocolate or vanilla? Chocolate, Tommy mumbled, already half asleep again. And a big wedding. With doves. And maybe a clown. Evelyn shook her head, reaching for Tommy's blanket and tucking it around him again. You're delirious. Tommy let out a sleepy giggle. May, babe. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching as Evelyn fussed over the boy. There was something different about her now. The walls were still there, still strong, but they weren't impenetrable. He didn't expect her to open up overnight, but he had learned something important. She wasn't as indifferent to him as she pretended to be. He'd take that as a win. For now. Tommy had been doing better. At least, that's what everyone had thought. The fever scare had been terrifying, but he had bounced back, making jokes and pushing through his treatments with the same stubborn resilience he always had. He had even managed to eat a full bowl of soup the night before, something Evelyn had taken as a small victory. But then, the color drained from his face. His breathing became uneven. And by morning, the light in his eyes had dimmed in a way that made Evelyn's heart pound with fear. She had been arguing with him, or at least trying to, when it happened. You need to drink more water, she had said, holding out the cup for him. Tommy had groaned dramatically, throwing his head back. Grandma, I'm basically a cactus. I store water. Evelyn had rolled her eyes, but before she could push the cup toward him again, Tommy blinked hard, like he was trying to clear his vision. Then his fingers trembled as he reached for the blanket. I don't feel so good, he murmured. And then his body went limp. Evelyn's world snapped into chaos. Nurses flooded the room, alarms beeped, voices shouted orders, and she could do nothing, but stand there as Tommy's small body was wheeled away, his face pale, his limbs slack. A doctor's voice cut through the haze, the words hitting her like gunfire. He's crashing. Evelyn's knees almost buckled. Richard was there before she even realized it, stepping beside her, his hand firm at her elbow. Come on, he said quietly, guiding her out of the room before the medical staff shut the doors behind them. The last thing she saw before they closed was Tommy's motionless body on the bed, surrounded by frantic nurses. She felt like she couldn't breathe. They ended up in the waiting room, though Evelyn barely remembered how she got there. The walls felt too close, the air too thin. She stood still for a long moment, hands clenched into fists, until the weight of it all crushed down on her. The strength she had fought so hard to hold on to crumbled in an instant. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself break. I can't lose him, she choked out, her voice raw. I can't do this again. Richard sat beside her, silent for a moment. Then, without hesitation, he reached for her hand. He didn't say anything at first, just let his fingers close around hers, warm and steady. He wasn't the kind of man to offer meaningless reassurances, and she knew that. But when he finally spoke, his voice was unwavering. If there's a way to save him, he said, we'll find it. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to believe that. God, she needed to believe that. But she had lost too much before. Her daughter. Her son-in-law. She had fought to hold Tommy's world together, to be strong enough for both of them, but now it felt like fate was ripping him away from her too. And yet as she sat there, trembling, Richard's hand never let go of hers. She didn't move away. The hours crawled by. Every time a nurse walked past, Evelyn's stomach twisted with fear. What if they came with bad news? What if this was the time they told her he wasn't going to make it? The thought made her chest tighten, her breath shallow. Richard never left. Not once. He stayed beside her, keeping his hand in hers whenever she needed it, letting go when she pulled away, and offering her silence when she couldn't find words. At some point, exhaustion weighed down on her. The stress, the fear, it all blurred together. She didn't realize she had drifted into a light sleep until she was jolted awake by the sound of a door opening. She shot up immediately, pulse racing, as a doctor stepped into the waiting area. She was bracing for the worst, prepared for it. But then, miraculously, "He's awake," the doctor said. Evelyn nearly collapsed with relief. Richard's hand was still on her arm, steadying her, as they followed the doctor down the hall. Tommy looked fragile when they stepped inside, his face still too pale, his eyelids heavy. But when his eyes fluttered open, there was a spark of mischief there, a familiar light that made something inside Evelyn crack wide open. "Oh good," Tommy croaked, voice raspy but amused. "You guys are still here. I was afraid you'd run off and eloped while I was out." Evelyn let out a half laugh, half sob, covering her face for a moment before exhaling sharply. "You nearly died, and that's what you're thinking about?" Richard smirked, stepping closer to the bed. "You should be honored. Your timing was impeccable. If you had been unconscious for a few more days, maybe we would have." Tommy's eyes widened. Evelyn smacked Richard's arm before turning back to her grandson. "He's lying." Richard winced dramatically. "You wound me, Evelyn." Tommy grinned, clearly enjoying the exchange. He shifted under the blanket, still weak but obviously thrilled to be alive. "Look, all I'm saying," he said, pausing to clear his throat, "is that was a real in sickness and in health moment back there. You guys were totally holding hands." Evelyn groaned, while Richard just chuckled. "The kid has a point." Evelyn shot him a glare, but there was no real heat behind it. Instead, she turned back to Tommy, brushing his hair back in a way that was far gentler than she would ever admit. "You're a menace," she muttered. Tommy's smirk never wavered. "Yeah, but I'm your menace." Evelyn sighed, shaking her head, but Richard could see the way her lips twitched at the corners. The sheer relief in her posture. The way she kept checking Tommy's pulse, his breathing, as if still making sure he was really here. Richard glanced between them, something warm settling in his chest. He hadn't expected this, any of this. He had come into their lives as a stranger, a man who had simply stopped to buy lemonade. And now, standing in this hospital room, watching this stubborn woman and this impossible boy bicker like they hadn't just walked through hell together, he realized something. He wasn't a stranger anymore. And he didn't want to be. The weeks that followed were a blur of small victories, careful optimism, and a boy too stubborn to let cancer win. The worst had passed, and slowly, day by day, Tommy began to regain his strength. The color returned to his cheeks, his appetite improved, and his energy, though still inconsistent, became stronger with every passing afternoon. The doctors monitored him closely, running tests, adjusting treatments, but then, one morning, the news finally came. The chemo worked. Evelyn felt the breath leave her lungs as the words sank in. She had been sitting beside Tommy's bed, absently rubbing circles into the back of his hand, a habit she hadn't even realized she had picked up. Richard stood near the window, hands in his pockets, his usual calm mask in place, but even he couldn't completely hide the flicker of relief in his expression. Tommy, meanwhile, took the announcement in stride, as if he had expected nothing less. "Of course it worked," he said, arms crossed over his chest like a pint-sized CEO closing a major deal. "I told you guys I planned to live forever. Just to spite cancer." Evelyn let out a laugh, an actual laugh. It was hoarse, raw, and maybe even a little watery, but it was real. She squeezed Tommy's hand, because she needed to, because she had spent too long fearing she'd never be able to do it again. Richard exhaled, stepping closer to the bed. "Well, I suppose now we have to put up with you for a few more decades." "Darn right," Tommy said, grinning up at him. Then, as if remembering something very important, he sat up a little straighter, eyes twinkling with mischief. "Okay, I survived. Now when's the wedding?" Evelyn nearly choked. Richard, to his credit, just smirked. "I see the anesthesia hasn't affected your priorities." Tommy pointed between them. "Look, I'm just saying, I almost died, and you two totally had a moment. Multiple moments, actually. In sickness and in health and all that. So let's make it official, yeah? Evelyn groaned, rubbing her temples. Why did I ever let you watch those Hallmark movies? Character development, Tommy shot back. Also, Grandma, I saw you holding his hand. No takebacks. Richard, ever the businessman, turned to Evelyn with a perfectly measured look. Well, you heard the kid. Should I start looking at engagement rings? Evelyn leveled him with a glare, but there was no real bite behind it. If anything, she almost looked amused. Almost. You start looking at rings, and I start looking for a new hospital to throw you in. Tommy flopped back onto his pillows, sighing dramatically. Ugh, adults. So slow. Richard chuckled, shaking his head, and for a moment, the room felt lighter than it had in weeks. The weight that had been pressing down on all of them was still there, but it was no longer unbearable. The days that followed were filled with preparations for Tommy's discharge. He still had a long road ahead of him, regular checkups, careful monitoring, but he was going home. The hospital room that had once felt like a prison now buzzed with an almost giddy energy as Tommy counted down the minutes until he could finally sleep in his own bed again. Evelyn, though relieved, was hesitant. She hovered more than usual, fussed more than she probably should have. She double-checked medication schedules, reread the doctor's instructions until they were practically engraved in her memory. She had spent so long bracing for the worst that she didn't quite know how to settle into the relief of the best-case scenario. Richard saw it, of course. He always did. You're allowed to breathe, you know, he told her one afternoon as they sat together in Tommy's room, waiting for his final round of tests to be completed. Evelyn kept her eyes on the clipboard in her lap. I'm breathing just fine. Richard tilted his head. Are you? She hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the clipboard before she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. I don't know how, she admitted, voice quiet. For so long, every day has been about waiting for bad news. Preparing for it. Now suddenly, I'm supposed to believe we're in the clear? She shook her head. I don't trust it. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. You don't have to trust it yet. Just let yourself be in it. One step at a time. She scoffed, shaking her head. You make it sound so easy. It's not, he said, softer now. But you don't have to do it alone. That made her pause. Because that was the part she wasn't ready to face. Richard had been there for Tommy, for her. And that was the problem. It was easy to rely on him, too easy. And if she let herself get used to it, let herself believe in it, what happened if he left? She had lost too much already. She wasn't sure she could survive losing someone else. Richard seemed to sense her thoughts, because he didn't push. He never did. Instead, he simply sat beside her, offering his presence, his patience. Tommy's discharge day arrived with more fanfare than expected. The nurses threw together a small celebration, complete with balloons and a cheap "Congrats!" banner taped to the wall. Tommy, of course, ate up every second of it, grinning from ear to ear as he was wheeled out of the hospital, arms full of gifts from the staff who had grown attached to him over the weeks. Evelyn, standing by his side, watched it all with an unreadable expression. When Richard stepped beside her, she finally spoke. He almost didn't make it. But he did, Richard said. She exhaled. Yeah. He did. As Tommy was loaded into the car, he shot them both a knowing look. You guys are taking forever, by the way. Evelyn blinked. Taking forever to do what? Tommy grinned. To realize that you're totally into each other. Richard chuckled, slipping his hands into his pockets. Patience, kid. Tommy huffed. You two are the worst. Evelyn shook her head, but this time, her laughter came easily. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself enjoy the moment. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep bracing for the worst anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it alone. The adjustment to life outside the hospital was both a relief and a challenge. Tommy was home, but Evelyn still found herself waking up in the middle of the night, creeping into his room just to make sure he was still breathing. The fear hadn't vanished overnight, and maybe it never fully would. She had spent too much time bracing for loss to trust that it wouldn't come knocking again. But Tommy, ever the optimist, refused to live in fear. He jumped right back into life, as if daring the universe to try and take him down again. Richard, meanwhile, hadn't disappeared. If anything, he had become even more present. He stopped by nearly every day, bringing groceries, picking up Tommy from appointments, even helping Evelyn fix the squeaky porch steps she had been meaning to get to for years. She hadn't asked him to do any of it, and yet, somehow, she had gotten used to him being there. Used to seeing his car pull up, used to hearing his voice in the kitchen while he talked to Tommy about superheroes and stocks in the same breath. And then, one afternoon, he dropped a bombshell. They were sitting outside, Tommy bundled in a blanket despite the warm weather, sipping lemonade on the porch. Richard had been quieter than usual, which was already a warning sign. Then, just as Evelyn was about to call him out on it, he set down his glass and said it so casually it nearly gave her whiplash. "I'm retiring." Evelyn blinked. "What?" Tommy sat up straighter. "Wait, like retiring? Richard nodded, hands clasped together as if this wasn't the most absurd thing he could have possibly announced. "I sold off my shares this morning. I'm officially stepping away from the company." Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "You just walked away?" "I wouldn't say walked," Richard mused, taking a sip of his lemonade. "It was more of a very expensive negotiation process. But yes, I'm done." Tommy let out a low whistle. "Dang. What are you gonna do now? Play golf?" Richard smirked. "God, no." Evelyn was still trying to process it. Richard Harrington was not the type of man to just walk away from the empire he had built. He was one of those people whose entire life revolved around work, who thrived on power and deals and always being 10 steps ahead. And yet, here he was, saying he had just let it all go. She folded her arms, narrowing her eyes. "And why exactly did you do that?" Richard met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something there she hadn't been ready to see. A quiet certainty. A decision made not out of obligation, but out of something much deeper. "I bought a house," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Tommy choked on his lemonade. "Excuse me?" Richard turned to him, amused. "I bought a house. Here. In the neighborhood." Evelyn stared at him like he had lost his mind. You what?" Richard shrugged, but there was something deliberate in the way he said it. "I figured if I'm retiring I might as well go all in. I don't need the penthouse, the boardrooms, any of it. I want a quieter life. Something simple." Tommy's jaw dropped. Wait. You're moving in? Should I start calling you Grandpa Richie?" Richard chuckled. "I think that might be a little premature." Evelyn was still reeling. "Richard, you don't just buy a house and change your whole life like that. Why not?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've spent 20 years chasing things that don't matter. And in the last few months, I've realized that the only time I actually felt like I had something worth holding onto was here." Evelyn felt her breath catch. Tommy, entirely oblivious to the weight of what was being said, waved his hand between them. "Okay, but just to be clear, are we talking next door neighbor Richard or down the street Richard?" Richard smirked. 3 houses down. "So you won't be able to see me through the window, but close enough to steal my Wi-Fi." Tommy pumped his fist. "Sweet." Evelyn, on the other hand, was still trying to wrap her head around it. Richard had turned his entire life upside down for them. And that scared her. Because if he could do that, it meant he was serious. And if he was serious, then what? She had spent so long being afraid of attachment. She had kept her world small, manageable, so that nothing could be taken from her again. But Richard had pushed his way in anyway, without asking, without waiting for permission. And now, she wasn't sure what scared her more, the idea of losing him, or the idea of actually letting him stay. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I need a drink." Richard chuckled. There's lemonade right there. Evelyn shot him a look. Something stronger. Tommy leaned forward, grinning. So does this mean you guys are finally dating? Evelyn groaned. For the love of... Richard, still smirking, raised his glass of lemonade. To be continued. Tommy snickered. You two are the worst. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head, but this time, she didn't argue. Because maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to believe it was okay to let him stay. Richard settled into his new life faster than Evelyn was prepared for. It seemed absurd how seamlessly he fit into their daily routine, as if he had been a part of it all along. He showed up for dinner more often than not, helped Tommy with his math homework, which, to Tommy's dismay, Richard actually enjoyed, and even managed to fix the old screen door that had been rattling for months without Evelyn having to ask. It was unnerving, the way he just slid into place. And the worst part? She didn't mind. Tommy, of course, took this as an open invitation to escalate his matchmaking. If he had been subtle before, and he hadn't, he was now entirely shameless. So, he mused one evening over dinner, casually stabbing at his mashed potatoes. When's the date? Evelyn, who had just taken a sip of water, nearly choked. She set her glass down, glaring. What? Tommy shrugged. The date. You know, the one where you and Richard finally stop pretending and just accept that you're totally into each other. Richard smirked but said nothing, enjoying the show. Evelyn pointed her fork at her grandson. You have been watching too many rom-coms. Tommy ignored her. I mean, he moved to our neighborhood and basically spends every free moment with us. That's dating behavior, Grandma. Evelyn turned her glare to Richard now, who simply leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, looking far too pleased with himself. Well? She snapped. Well, what? Richard asked, amusement flickering in his eyes. Are you going to say something? He tilted his head. About what? Evelyn groaned. Unbelievable. Tommy grinned. That's not a no. Richard chuckled then, with infuriating ease, set his napkin down and looked straight at her. Evelyn. She stilled. He didn't hesitate. Would you like to go on a date with me? Silence. Tommy nearly vibrated with excitement. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, trying to find the trap, the teasing, the loophole. But there was none. Richard looked at her with quiet certainty, like he had already accepted whatever answer she gave. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't demanding. And that was what made it worse. Because she wanted to say yes. And that terrified her. She exhaled sharply. One date. She finally muttered. Just one. Tommy fist pumped the air. Richard smirked. One date. For now. It took a few days for them to settle on a plan. Evelyn refused anything extravagant, no fancy restaurants, no 5-course meals with candlelight and menus in French. She didn't want to be Richard Harrington's business dinner companion. She wanted something simple, something real. So they settled on a quiet little cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and checkered tablecloths, where the coffee was strong and the food was served on plates that had probably been around since the 70s. And to Evelyn's complete and utter frustration, it was nice. It was awkward at first. She wasn't used to dating. Wasn't used to being looked at like that, with a mix of amusement and admiration. Richard seemed to enjoy watching her try to pretend she wasn't flustered. But as the night went on, something softened between them. They laughed a lot. Richard told stories about his disastrous first attempt at cooking. He had set a steak on fire in ways that defied logic. Evelyn told him about the time Tommy had tried to fix the toaster and ended up short-circuiting the entire kitchen. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt light. When he walked her home, she felt Tommy's watchful eyes from the window. The boy had zero shame, peeking through the curtains like a spy on a high-stakes mission. Richard chuckled. Your grandson is not subtle. Evelyn sighed. He thinks if he stares hard enough, we'll kiss in the driveway like we're in a movie. Richard smirked. Should we give him a show? She swatted his arm. Absolutely not. Tommy was waiting when she walked inside, arms crossed. So? How'd it go? You two getting married or what? Evelyn groaned, hanging up her coat. Go to bed, Tommy. Tommy wagged a finger. Dodging the question, I see. She ruffled his hair before he could escape, making him squawk in protest. Bed. Now. But later that night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she let herself admit something she hadn't been able to before. She didn't want to be alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be. The next morning, Richard was already at the house, drinking coffee at her kitchen table like he belonged there. He was reading the paper, completely at ease, while Tommy shoveled cereal into his mouth. Evelyn rolled her eyes. You live 3 houses down. Why are you always here? Richard smirked over the rim of his mug. Convenience. Tommy grinned mid-chew. Grandpa Richie, don't fight it. You're basically part of the family now. Evelyn froze. Richard's expression didn't change, at least, not much. But she saw it, the way his eyes softened, the way his grip on his mug tightened just slightly. He set the coffee down. Is that right? Tommy shrugged. I mean, you bought a house here. You show up for dinner. You saved my life. Pretty sure you qualify. Evelyn cleared her throat. We're not adopting you, Richard. Richard turned to her with mock disappointment. Damn. I was really hoping for a new last name. Tommy nudged Evelyn. You gonna marry him or what? Evelyn groaned. Oh my God! Richard, still smirking, met her gaze. I think the kid has a point. She rolled her eyes. You two are impossible. But she was smiling. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't fight it. Richard reached across the table, resting a hand over hers. You'll never have to be alone again, he said softly. And this time, she let herself believe him. Snow dusted the ground in a thin layer, shimmering under the glow of the streetlights. Inside the house, warmth radiated from the kitchen, where the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air. The radio hummed with an old Christmas tune, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt something she hadn't dared to let herself feel in a long time: peace. Tommy was tearing through the living room, his energy seemingly endless now that he was fully healthy. Months ago, she had wondered if she would ever see him like this again, running, laughing, cheeks flushed not with fever but with excitement. Now, watching him dodge around the coffee table, narrowly avoiding knocking over the Christmas tree, Evelyn felt like she had been granted a miracle. Richard sat on the couch, holding a cup of coffee, watching the chaos unfold with an amused expression. You do realize, he said, glancing at Evelyn, that he's probably not going to sleep for the next 3 days. Evelyn huffed, placing a tray of cookies on the table. Oh, I'm very aware. But at least it's a problem I get to have. Richard's gaze softened at that. He didn't need to say anything, the meaning was clear. They had come so close to losing him, and now, here they were, whole, together. Tommy skidded to a stop beside the couch, eyes gleaming with mischief. All right, let's get to the important stuff. Presents. Richard chuckled, setting his mug down. I was wondering how long it would take for you to bring that up. Evelyn rolled her eyes but reached for the gifts under the tree, handing Tommy a bright red box. This one's from me. Tommy ripped into it like a wild animal, paper flying in every direction. When he finally got to the box inside, his eyes widened. No way! He pulled out the brand new pair of sneakers he had been begging for, the kind all the other kids at school had. Grandma! He launched himself at her, squeezing her in a hug. You actually listened! Evelyn scoffed, but she held him tight. I always listen, kiddo. I just don't always give in. Richard smirked. Noted. Tommy turned to him expectantly. Okay, your turn, Grandpa Richie. What did you get me? Richard exhaled dramatically. Wow. No patience whatsoever. He reached beside him, pulling out a thin, neatly wrapped envelope. All right, here you go. Tommy frowned at it. This is suspiciously flat. Evelyn watched, curious now, as Tommy tore open the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers. His eyebrows furrowed as he read the first few lines, lips moving slightly before he stilled. Evelyn saw it then, the exact moment he understood. His fingers trembled around the edges, his breath catching. "Is this?" Richard leaned forward, his voice softer now, but steady. "It's adoption papers, kid. If you want, I'd like to officially be your grandfather." Tommy's face crumpled. For the first time in months, he had no joke, no snarky remark, no clever quip. He just stared at Richard, as if trying to convince himself that this was real. His eyes welled with tears, his bottom lip trembling. Then, without a word, he lunged forward, nearly knocking Richard off the couch as he wrapped his arms around him, clinging on as tightly as he could. Evelyn felt her own throat tighten. Tommy buried his face in Richard's shoulder, his small frame shaking. "Best lemonade sale ever," he whispered. Richard let out a quiet, shaky chuckle, squeezing the boy just as tightly. "Yeah, kid. Best one ever." Evelyn had spent so long trying to keep her world small, to keep her heart safe. She had resisted letting Richard in, had tried to pretend that she didn't need anyone else, that she and Tommy could make it through alone. But now, watching them, this man who had started as a stranger, who had saved her grandson's life, who had become part of their family, she realized how wrong she had been. She had been afraid of losing, but she had never stopped to consider what it would mean to gain something back. Richard looked up at her then, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. His hand rested lightly on Tommy's back, but his eyes were on her, patient, steady, waiting for her to say something, to let herself believe it. So she did. She stepped forward, reached out, and placed a hand over Richard's. "You're a fool, you know," she murmured. Richard smirked. "I've been told." Evelyn exhaled, shaking her head, but she was smiling. Smiling in a way she hadn't in years. "You really want to do this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Be in this. With us." Richard didn't hesitate. "I already am." Tommy pulled back slightly, wiping at his teary eyes with his sleeve before turning toward Evelyn. "So, since Grandpa Richie is officially part of the family now, does this mean we finally get to talk about wedding plans?" Evelyn groaned. "For the love of—" Richard laughed. Tommy grinned, settling back against them, as if everything had fallen into place exactly as it should. And maybe it had. Because for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn wasn't afraid anymore. As the snow fell outside and the laughter filled the house, she realized they had found something priceless, not luck, not fate, but something stronger. Family.